Hello and welcome to Florida Watch. I'm your host, Doug Miles. Joining me on the panel today are Susan Nyland, host of Talk of Suncoast radio show. Cooper Levy-Baker, he's the editor of the Florida Independent, as well as former CBS White House correspondent Gary Schuster. We do like to welcome our newest member sitting in for Dennis Maley today, making our panel look a lot better.
Oh,
Susan Nyland, thanks for being with us.
Very sweet of you, thanks.
And biggest topic this week, of course, the Florida legislature getting underway earlier this week. And Cooper, I know you've been covering that pretty closely. Any big surprises? Although I guess not a lot of action yet, right?
Yeah, I mean, there haven't been too many surprises. I mean, some on the fringes, which we can probably talk about later. But the sort of main action that you've seen so far, I think, has been pretty scripted. And this is the resolution that they had opposing federal health care reform, which is a top priority of the state legislature. You also see a lot of movement on cuts to the social safety net. So just yesterday, they passed in the State House cuts to unemployment benefits. You also see a bill moving forward that's going to cut the Medicaid program and push Medicaid recipients into sort of private managed care plans. And all that stuff is what we've seen coming for the past couple weeks. So I think that you definitely have to look at Mike Karadopoulos in the state Senate and Dean Cannon in the state House, that they've kind of set this up and scripted this first week pretty well. And I think have really capitalized on the exposure. And so, but we'll see, you know, there's always going to be surprises. There's always going to be like late night bills and amendments and additions and debates and things. So I think that, you know, they're not out of the woods yet. Certainly there's a couple months to go. But I think that they kind of did accomplish what they hoped to accomplish this first week.
I think usually in a start of a legislative session, it sort of has a momentum that sort of builds as it goes, starting with bill introductions, some things they got to get out of the way, resolutions, that kind of thing. But I think we'll see a lot more activity in the next couple weeks. You know, one of the things that, as you were saying, they did some things about cutting Medicaid, some other payments, unemployment. That's going to put this state in a tough situation going forward, I think, because Moody's has already said that there's a chance that Florida could be bankrupt, perhaps, even. They said that the money from the tax cuts that the governor wants, plus the use of all the reserves that are sort of gone, is going to put this state in a financial bind. You also have the public employees issue that's coming up that Wisconsin just dealt with and Ohio is dealing with now, and other states. So all those things, I think, mean a real financial crunch for this state. And in that 60-day period, now 55 or whatever it is, it's going to be tough for them to deal with.
I also think, too, what's going to change this session is the activism that we're going to see. While last time during the elections, they came off the elections pretty confident that with a veto-proof majority, they would be able to basically go through their shopping list of personal items on their agenda and get it taken care of. But because a lot of those items have been left over from last session and are now this session, and because of the fear of the veto-proof majority, you're going to find a lot of the activist groups are going to be in Tallahassee more and more often, just like this week where you had Tea Party and a progressive movement there at the same time, and almost every day this week something has been scheduled. And whereas they might have thought they had a little bit more power, they're now going to actually look at their constituents more on a regular basis in Tallahassee than just waiting until they go home when most of it's over.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've already seen, kind of following up on those protests Tuesday when they initially kicked off, like some Tea Party groups have already held some like lobbying sessions with state legislators. I think that was Thursday. They kind of named that as a big day for them. And you already see Americans for Prosperity. This is kind of a big financial backer of some of these Tea Party groups. They're already planning another day, a Tea Party day of rallies later on in March. And so I do think that there's going to be a lot more popular pressure this year than most. And, you know, with Scott in the governor's mansion, I mean, he seems very responsive to that and sort of like he is really catering to this Tea Party movement. And so they could definitely have sort of more influence over the debate than, you know, you've seen populist movements in the past couple of years. I think that's true.
Yeah, I think you're going to see that and more from communities. You're going to see a lot of mayors groups, commissioners groups, because of all these different budget items that are going to be coming up as they work on that budget. that's where you're going to see the fireworks, I think.
And Manatee County is going to send up a delegation to Tallahassee, some of their commissioners, to make the pitch because of funding and all that. But just watching a little bit last night, the education bill being talked about. I saw Mike Bennett, of course, right here from Bradenton talking about that, which I guess is eventually, or I guess the thought is to kind of eliminate tenure and make teachers more accountable. That's a big topic, not only in Florida, but in other states.
Exactly.
What do you see about
exactly.
that bill?
Well, I think that, I mean, that's something that I was up in Tampa the other day, just driving through, and they had after school, they had a huge teachers protest out on the curbs of a major intersection up there on US 19 and McMullen Booth, or right near that intersection. You're going to see more of those spontaneous grassroots. Bring your sign and bring your shorts and T-shirts for after school because we want you out there protesting. I think you're going to see that. But yes, the bill as it's moving takes tenure away and gives 1-year contracts to teachers, and a lot of it's based on performance, which is based on testing. So it's not just a, here you go, you're here next year, fine, whether you did well or not, or whether your kids did well or not. This is going to be performance, and the governor is all for that, so it could be accepted quickly.
Don't you think that's in a way fair? I mean, that's the only industry, as Mike Bennett was saying, that you can have a job for life just based on seniority, or should teachers have a special benefit since, well, the argument is they're taking less money to take that kind of work?
Well, I think the problem is that we lump all the issues with education into one bill. You can argue tenure, and most teachers these days won't necessarily argue it. If they have to let something go, they'll let tenure go. The tenure is almost like a battling ram for a negotiation more than anything else. However, merit pay is a big issue, and what disturbs most teachers is that the legislators have never been in a classroom to understand really what that measurement is of how well they do. How do you base it? Each child in a classroom is different. The makeup of the classroom is different. The subject is different. When you mainstream special education children into a regular classroom, do you take those things into consideration? Behavior in classroom. I know my son is in middle school right now, and a good section of the year, all he does is learn the FCAT. Why? Because it's so important. Well, if a teacher is going to find themselves in a year out of a job because their scores weren't well, is there a tendency then just to teach the test? And then what happens to the rest of education? I mean, I think it's a fine line between wanting to improve the issue and wanting to better our children's education than to essentially hold the teacher's feet to the fire.
I think also too, I mean, kind of following up on that point, some of the problems that you'll see popping up. I was talking with one of our writers yesterday, and he raised a point that if you're paying teachers based on their performance and you're paying ones that do well more, and at the same time you're having your budget cut, there's almost a disincentive to hire more quality teachers, and it's better to have sort of perhaps middle of the road teachers who are not committed, they're not going to be lifelong servants. And so I think you're going to see school administrators and local school districts really forced into tough decisions about who they hire and who they let go. So I think that, I think you're right. I mean, I think all these issues can't really be just summed up, and I think that you're going to see some efforts to try to decouple those. I think that's really the only way that like teachers and education supporters can fight this bill, because it seems really on the fast track. And so the only way I think that they're going to have any success is if they can really convince some people to take it apart and vote on individual parts separately.
It's going to be tough to do, though.
Yeah.
It's going to be tough to do because one of the legislators was talking the other day who is a teacher in Miami, Democrat, who said there is in this bill that's moving through the legislature no amount of merit pay. They don't quite know what the amount is.
Yeah.
So how are you going to pay somebody? Does everybody get the same amount of merit pay if they're good? I mean, there's so many things here that are going to make it difficult for these legislators to get their hands around and either decouple or couple right, so that the outside forces, the lobbying groups, will sort of back it. And like I say, the governor's all for this. So you got a couple forces here at work.
Well, and I would say my concern more than anything else is that kind of what Cooper touched upon. you know, what's going to keep us from to get good teachers? I mean, to be honest with you, you know, I'd be really hard pressed to find somebody right now at this point in time to say, yeah, I want to be a teacher right now. I want to go into that industry. I'm going to spend 4 years of education and rack up a lot of bills so I can go into an industry that isn't very much appreciated. It doesn't really respect my ability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And may not be well paid.
And even though they're real quick to say what the medium range is, they never indicate, like right now I know in Wisconsin they're saying that the average salary is $80,000 a year. But they never indicate how long it took a teacher to get there. And they never indicate how many degrees that teacher had to acquire in order to get that. I mean, there's a lot of things that are, you know, not taken into consideration when we're talking about just public knowledge.
Well, New York is obviously a state where you don't want to be a teacher right now. I think Mayor Bloomberg is going to lay off 4,000, and it could be more. I mean, it's a similar situation. You mentioned Wisconsin as well. Let's move on to that a little bit. Gary, I know you and I were talking about it a little bit yesterday. Governor Scott Walker, I guess, succeeds in passing that legislation which limits the bargaining power of public servant unions, right?
Yeah, I mean, they passed it sort of surreptitiously. The Democrats left so they wouldn't have a quorum, but then they took the financial items out of the bill, made it just a language bill, and passed it without the quorum, much to the Democrats and the unions' dismay. The unions have promised to go to court on this because they said the way they did it was unconstitutional. Whether it was or not, who knows? I don't know that, but it's not over. It's not over. But it has set the pattern. Ohio did it while Wisconsin was in the throes of all this noise. Ohio went and did it, and Kasich is the new governor, is going to sign that bill. It'll happen in Michigan. It'll happen in other states, and the issue is going to come here. I mean, it has to come here.
Yeah, you already see a lot of debate over it, not exactly the same with the question of collective bargaining, but just over how unions can collect their dues. And that's a bill that actually has already kind of gotten some traction in Tallahassee this week. Essentially what it does is it strips the right of unions to collect their dues via payroll deductions, and also limits what they can do with that money, so they can't spend it on political candidates the way that they normally would. And so it's a different measure, but essentially the same goal, which is to really go after these public sector unions. And the sort of arguments being made are so extravagant, you know, that sort of they're coercing their workers into giving the money to the candidates. There are specific procedures that they can opt out of giving their money to these candidates if they want to. So I do think that you see that, and it is going to come to Florida. I think maybe not as quite as sort of large scale or as massive or as raucous, but I do think that you're going to see this. And already, you know, union activists are really active in Tallahassee trying to fight this. They really call it a death knell for their unions here in Florida. So I think that that's definitely an issue to be watching here.
But is it really taking away a lot of power from the unions? I mean, it's really just saying the union members have more say in how their money goes, right?
Union members already have a lot of say in what their unions do. You know, when you're talking about each individual union, I've never seen a situation where something doesn't come to vote. And like Cooper said, they have the option to opt out and things. And in Florida, with the right to work state, you know, you don't have to be a member of a union to work here, but you still have the benefits of the union, because whatever the union negotiates, you get that too. What I see it as is all these rules and regulations and pieces of legislation that are being put through are basically systematically trying to dismantle the power of the union altogether. So not only are they taking away their power, but they're increasing the amount of work and labor that they're going to have to do, the expenses. Right now it's easy to collect union dues because it does come through the paycheck, but now that they're going to have to take individual fees from, you know, it's going to require somebody to do that, and it's going to require a lot of time and effort and energy, and that's just a way to pick a group apart.
Gary, I mean, you've been a member of a union in the broadcast industry, the newspaper industry as well. I mean, is the union movement dying, or is it just shifting back to maybe more of a middle ground?
Well, you know, I was a member of the Screen Actors Guild kind of thing when I was at CBS, and not at the paper because I was in management there before the union got into place. But I know over time the union at the paper, at the Detroit News where I was, now a combined paper with the Detroit Free Press, that union is not as strong as it used to be, and it was not able to do the things it wanted to do because they had shrunken these papers. So that that industry is dying in a lot of ways in a lot of places and is hurting the union because there just isn't, the money for them to work at it. So that's an issue. I think, you've seen in the past unions in the airline industry that had so much trouble. The airlines declared bankruptcy and got rid of the unions. That could happen in the States. It happened with the auto companies. It happened with General Motors. It's a combined function. It's an economic function and it's a social function. And those two things, when they come together like they have in some of these states and industries, does not bode well for the unions.
I know we don't talk sports necessarily in the program, but seeing the same thing in the NFL. You have the NBA, which is going to have a CBA agreement. Baseball is coming up soon, so it's on all levels, isn't it?
Oh, sure. I mean, the umpires have a union. The umpires, the senior umpires in the American League or National League, they now work both, are making $400,000 plus a year as senior umpires. You talk about senior teachers, how much they make. That's what the umpires are making for about a 7-month season, roughly.
Well, but when you compare that to what the players are making, I mean, that's nothing.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I'm just saying that's the strength of that union. The umpires didn't used to have a union, and now they do. The players have the unions. I mean, that's where people who can't get the discussions with the owners and the mayors and the city governments, they form a union. And they think there's strength in that, and there used to be. And there is now to some degree, but I will tell you it's lessening, as we all know, around the country in all areas.
What I also consider that if that is the case and then unions are no longer as important as they used to be, then what is going to happen to individual worker rights? Is that going to increase the amount of litigation that we have with the employers or within the state? I mean, somewhere someone has to deal with someone's injustice or felt injustice. And right now, the way I see a union representative is basically that, their representative. And if they don't have that, then I just see an increase in other areas that will deal with it in other ways.
Following up too on that point about workers' rights, there's actually a law that's in front of the state legislature right now which would limit the ability of local communities to pass wage theft ordinances. Wage theft is when, sort of a worker has his wages just kept from him by his employer. And a lot of local communities have passed laws because this is a really serious problem, particularly in South Florida when you have immigrant workers. And there's a state law that they're considering now that would ban local communities from doing this. So I think that you see a real attack not just on unions but also on workers' rights. And this is a specific case where a local law was passed to help workers recover wages that have been stolen from them. And you have the people in Tallahassee working to undermine those laws. I mean, I find that really astonishing. And so I think that it's not just an attack on union, but also on workers' rights, their ability to deal with their employers on a level playing field. And so I think that there's a lot of other measures out there that we should have our eyes on this topic too.
Let's move on to another topic. As we taped this yesterday, Peter King, the representative from New York, opened hearings in Washington on the radicalization of American Muslims. Gentlemen, anything, and what lady, anything, sorry about that, Dennis is usually down there. But is anything positive going to come out of these, or is it just more people going to get upset over this? Gary, let's start with you.
I think it's always good if you air an issue. And this is being aired in a lot of ways. Perhaps, I mean, I heard a piece on the radio this morning on the way here somebody said that Peter King is not the right person because of his background to do this. But I think if you get it out, it'll be better, because there is a lot of pent-up anger about this issue in a lot of places, New York City being big where he is, but other places as well. And Muslim families around the country are feeling the pressures of this, who are, so the kids are American citizens born here, that kind of thing, but still being looked upon by their peers as something different. And so I think the more talk about this, the better it will be for the issue.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, I think it's at this point it's sort of scapegoating, a specific population, and I think that if he really wanted to address domestic terrorism, that's fine, But then you need to sort of, I think, include a whole panorama of kind of what that entails, white supremacists as well as Muslim terrorists. So I find it kind of troubling that they just specifically singled out, one ethnic minority to sort of look at this issue. Domestic terrorism is certainly obviously an issue that we should be learning more about and discussing. I just don't know if that's really the point or if this is simply a political enterprise that's really trying to, I think, provoke fear, in the American public. And I think it's a similar thing that you see too here in Florida with some of these laws that are being passed to provoke like encroaching Sharia law. There's no real threat of Sharia law taking over in Florida, and yet you see state legislators spending time debating these kinds of measures. And it really just, I think, makes people paranoid and makes people afraid when they have really very little reason to about like an issue like that. And so I think it distracts from kind of the real issues of terrorism that are out there.
What I also find disturbing about it is that it does not include anyone of the Muslim faith on those panels. So it basically, it puts anyone of the Muslim faith, on a platform that has everyone looking at them and saying, what is it that you're doing wrong, or what is it that you're not doing? So, and I don't know much about it to say anything more than, unfortunately, reminds me of the McCarthy era. Now, whether it goes that far, I don't know, and may not. It may just dissipate, but it's just, it's starting to feel that way, and that I find disturbing.
I wonder, too, if there could, sorry, Gary, I wonder if there's a backlash here. There was a testimony given by Representative Keith Ellison, who was the first Muslim elected to Congress yesterday.
Just what I was going to say.
Oh, okay, yeah. And it was a really touching story that he told about a 9/11 first responder who was Muslim, who died, and who there were sort of all these slanderous rumors about him possibly being in on the attacks and things like that came out immediately after, and just how traumatic that was for the family. And so I wonder if there's a possibility here that sort of viewers might gain some sympathy for people who have been subjected to kind of some of these rumors and lies and innuendos.
That was my point. That the more airing this gets, the more who people see Ellison's tears when he was talking about this story, how heartfelt that was. It may do more for the issue than just the sort of rumor that goes around, the talk that's happened. So I think if this goes a ways, I don't know this for sure, but King, being from New York, may have been sort of eased into this by supporters of his, contributors perhaps of his, who said, we have to have hearings, we have to do something about this. I don't know the origin of his hearings, but I think the fact that it needs more exposure, it needs more oxygen to sort of get at the roots of it, and maybe this is the start. I don't know, depend. But I'm hopeful.
It's an interesting point. I mean, so much of these discussions sometimes happen on like online forums, and sort of like in kind of innuendo and like trafficking kind of just rumors. And so I think that talking about
blogs, tweets, whatever it is, this has some kind of form to it. You may not like the form, but at least it's public.
That's true.
So.
Airs it out anyway.
Yes, yeah.
Well, it also holds those accountable who are on the panel into their actions, as opposed to things that would have normally happened behind closed doors. So.
Well, and the thing is, you can't be anonymous here.
Correct. That's my point.
Right,
yeah.
You can't be anonymous. If you want to say, you have to go out, you got to say it, show yourself, speak to it, rather than just anonymously putting in bangers, from the outside.
Let's move on to another topic quickly before we have to wrap up shortly. NPR funding, public broadcasting funding. Of course, that's going to be a big issue. But this week, Gary, the CEO of National Public Radio, resigned after some tapes surfaced where one of the representatives, I guess, said some things that maybe showed that the network might be one-sided. Is this kind of the end of public financing for public broadcasting?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I've listened to NPR on and off. I was in Washington. A friend of mine was a news editor of NPR for a long time. A guy I worked with at the White House, he used to be at the New York Daily News, was sort of the managing editor, news editor of the operation. He is now with Politico, actually. Yes, NPR's had its problems here recently with things they said about my old friend Juan Williams, black reporter and columnist that did some things, and so NPR, I think, serves a purpose. But like many other places, it can go too far sometimes. And I think that's what happened here. We'll see how it straightens out. I don't know that's the end of NPR, because a lot of people listen to NPR and get their information, their intelligence, their, sort of their basis for a lot of things from NPR. But you sort of have to watch, like everything else, where you get your stuff from.
Down to the final couple of minutes in the program today. Let's go around the table and see what's on everybody's mind. Susan, let's start with you.
Actually, one of the things that I'm going to be watching is, the 18 pieces of legislation that have been put forth this session in regarding women's rights, specifically their right of procreation or not to procreate. That to me is something that is also getting slid under the wire because of all the other things that are creating a loud noise. And the fact that there's 18 of them that challenges the woman's right to make a choice about what to do with her body, I find very disturbing. So that's my issue.
Sure.
Well, later today, the State Senate is actually going to be discussing the budget for this year. And we've obviously talked a lot and seen a lot about Rick Scott's budget proposals. And this is going to be our first glimpse, I think, into how seriously the legislature takes those, or if they're just going to go off and do their own thing. So I think that that's going to be really interesting to watch. And I think that that's just going to be the sort of opening shot in a long campaign.
I bet.
Gary?
A friend of mine died this week, Dave Broder, columnist for the Washington Post, reporter before, then columnist, political pundit, as they say. And an interesting thing about Broder, and I want to make sure, people who didn't see sort of the background of Dave, is that when a poll was done to find out the leanings, political leanings of pundits, he was the only one who was not assessed a leaning. They couldn't tell if he was a Democrat or a Republican, and they couldn't even tell if he was an independent.
Wow.
That is a good pundit. Because the way he went about his work was, he was reporter first. He got all the sides, and then put it out there for you to decide, not him. And that's what made him so special. So the journalism community is going to miss David Broder.
Made over 400 appearances on Meet the Press, perhaps more than anybody else, right?
Yeah, I did a lot of stuff socially with him and business-wise, but he was a gentleman and a great reporter.
Yeah, great, and he'll be missed, and we just want to mention him today. Susan, thank you for joining
You're
us.
welcome.
We're welcome back anytime.
Thank you for having me.
And we welcome everybody back as well. That's going to wrap it up for this week. I'd like to thank again the panel. Also thank you for joining us, which of course you can do each week here on METV at 9 a.m. on Sundays, or anytime at thebradentontimes.com. Until next week, I'm Doug Miles for Susan Nyland, Gary Schuster, and Cooper Levy Baker. So long, everybody.